You ever been hit with that sharp, unmistakable sting of being left out or, just flat out ignored? Social rejection can feel surprisingly physical, can it? Well, today we're going to get to the bottom of why. We're going to explore this whole paradox of our sensitivity, looking at everything from our brain chemistry all the way back to our deepest evolutionary roots.
I mean, it's such a modern, kind of silly thing when you think about it. You see those little read receipts and then nothing. The minutes tick by, and that feeling that sinks into your stomach can be so intense, totally out of proportion to what's actually happening. We've all been there, and it might feel like we're just overreacting, but what if that gut punch feeling is actually a message from a much older, much deeper part of ourselves?
So this really intense experience, it actually has a name: rejection sensitivity. Now, this isn't some formal diagnosis you'd get from a doctor. You should think of it more like a spectrum that we're all on. For some people, that dial is turned way, way up, and that means they don't just react intensely when they feel rejected, they're kind of anxiously expecting it to happen in the first place.
Okay, to really wrap our heads around this, we've got to look inside the brain, because that feeling of being hurt, it's not just a figure of speech. It turns out scientists have discovered something absolutely remarkable about the physical reality of emotional pain.
So, to figure this out, researchers used fMRI scans to look at the brains of people who'd just gone through a really painful breakup. First, they had them look at a picture of their ex, and then they applied a hot but totally safe probe to their arm to create physical pain. And the results? They were absolutely staggering.
And that's the key finding. Right there, straight from a landmark 2011 study. Suddenly, the phrase heartbreak seems a lot less like a metaphor, right? The pain we talk about in emotional terms? Well, it isn't just an idea. It has a clear, measurable twin in our brain's circuitry.
So here's the crucial part. It wasn't just the brain's emotional centers lighting up. It was also these two regions with some pretty technical names, the S2 and the DPINS, but their job is actually really simple to understand. They process the raw, sensory feeling of physical pain. In other words, when you get rejected, your brain registers it in a way that is just remarkably similar to an actual physical injury. It truly physically hurts, and for a very old reason we're going to get to in a minute.
Okay, so now we know what happens in the brain. But that doesn't really explain why some of us are so much more sensitive than others. Why does the same event totally devastate one person and barely even register for another? Well, that's where our personal history, our attachment, comes into play.
So imagine you've got this subconscious rulebook for relationships. It's built from literally thousands of little interactions with our earliest caregivers, and it silently guides our expectations. It's answering these huge questions for us. Are people generally safe? Can I count on connection? Can I depend on somebody else when I need help? Psychologists call this our internal working model.
And this is really where our individual sensitivities start to get wired in. If a child's early life was filled with care that was inconsistent, or maybe even emotional mistreatment, their internal rulebook gets written with a really painful expectation that rejection is probably just around the corner. It becomes this deeply ingrained forecast that colors how they see the world.
And you can see how that early template plays out so differently depending on someone's attachment style. For someone with an anxious style, rejection feels like a 5-alarm fire, triggering this desperate drive to reconnect. For the avoidant style, though, rejection is kind of the expected outcome, so the reflex is to just pull away to stop more hurt. And then the fearful avoidant can get caught in this chaotic storm of both reactions. The trigger's the same, but the internal programming creates these totally different results.
All right, so we've seen the brain's reaction, we've looked at our childhood programming, but to get the full picture, we have to zoom out. I mean, way out, all the way back to our deep evolutionary past. Why would we have even evolved such a painful response to being left out in the first place?
This, right here, this is the answer. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived in small cooperative groups. Belonging wasn't just, a nice to have. It was everything. Being ostracized, being cast out from the group, meant losing access to food, shelter, and protection from predators. It was, quite literally, a death sentence. So, because the stakes were just so incredibly high, we evolved an internal alarm system. You can basically think of it like a smoke detector for your social life, and it's designed to be crazy sensitive, to go off at the slightest hint of being pushed away. Why? Because the cost of missing a real threat was fatal, while the cost of a false alarm was just a little anxiety. And our childhood experiences, they act like a tuner for this alarm. Some of us just end up with a system that's extra sensitive.
And our self-esteem is a huge piece of this system. According to something called sociometer theory, it works kind of like a fuel gauge for social belonging.
It's not just about feeling good about yourself in a vacuum. It's constantly tracking how accepted and valued you are by others. When rejection hits, that needle plummets. And that painful drop in self-esteem, that's the alarm bell, warning you that your social fuel is dangerously low and you need to reconnect fast.
So let's just put all these pieces together for a second. That intense hurt you feel isn't a sign that you're weak or flawed or too sensitive. It's evidence that a deeply ingrained ancient survival system, one that was fine-tuned over millennia to literally keep you alive, is working perfectly. Okay, so now that we get what this alarm is all about, the question becomes, how do we live with it? We can't just switch it off, and honestly, we probably wouldn't want to. The key is to learn how to work with it, to hear the signal without letting it completely take over the controls.
And here are 4 really practical tools to do just that. First up, mindfulness. This is just about noticing the physical sensations and emotions of rejection without judging them as good or bad. They're just there. Next up, cognitive reframing. This means you actively question that automatic worst-case story. That unanswered text? Hey, maybe their phone died. There are other possibilities. Third, breathing exercises. Simple things like box breathing can directly calm your body's physical stress response, basically turning down the alarm's volume. And finally, self-compassion. Just ask yourself, how would I treat a good friend in this situation? And then try to offer that same kindness to yourself.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought. This deep sensitivity to connection, it's part of our evolutionary inheritance. It's what makes us such profoundly social creatures. So, instead of seeing it as a flaw that you need to fix, what if we saw it as a powerful signal, a kind of superpower, connecting us to a fundamental human need that we can actually learn to understand, regulate, and even master?